Hi, welcome to the DevOps Lab. I am Damian Brady.
And I'm Nick Blumhardt.
And today we are going to be talking about structured logging.
And how you should be prepared for diagnostics in production.
Perfect. See you then. Hi everyone, this is Damian coming to you for the DevOps Lab from sunny Brisbane back in Australia. I'm joined today by Nick Blumhardt, and we are going to be talking about structured logging and logging in production, which is a bit of a special interest of yours. You own and run a company that does a lot of this production logging, structured logging tooling for developers. And yeah, what we were talking about before was that a lot of the time when people talk about DevOps, they kind of stop when something hits production. You know, you deploy to production and then we're live and we have a party and so on, but that's not where the story stops.
No, this is, I guess, though for me, for the first probably 10 years that I was doing .NET development, just getting to production was the big challenge that everybody had to face. And I really watched over that time how we matured through unit testing, and then we moved along to continuous integration and automating builds, and we've actually gotten really quite good at getting code into production now. Where in the past all the big failures that you would hear about would be these projects that consume millions and millions of dollars and never shipped a line of code. We've actually gotten quite good at now getting the code out the door. And I think that the next sort of stage along our growing up in the ecosystem has been getting a lot better at doing production monitoring and diagnostics, because obviously the failures that you hear mostly about now are downtime and major bugs that are all the domain of code that has to be kept running predictably, I think.
And when something goes wrong, because things do go wrong, right? Nobody writes perfect software.
We used to just wait until somebody got on the phone to tell us when things were going wrong, I suppose. And
that's not a good situation.
No, but the tools have really exploded in the last few years for monitoring apps. The structured logging kind of idea has come out of just taking the kind of printf debugging that we used to do, console write line, and just trying to scale that up to something that was actually real engineering, so that you could plan for how you were going to monitor systems in production and how you were going to react to different kinds of errors, and eventually find ways to trace errors back to their causes, which is really the hardest thing to do in a big busy system. You've got things going on all over the place, and
so structured logging, just to boil it down to its essence, is, explain it to me. What exactly is structured logging?
Structured logging, we probably should flip over to some code.
Yeah, sure.
Right now we're looking at just a very basic console app, .NET Core console app, and you see the line that we've got highlighted there in the middle is the kind of logging code that we've been doing in .NET for a long time. It's just writing out some information about the environment that it's running in, that the code's running in, and that kind of logging, which we've all done using Log4Net, is focused on producing this kind of narrative of events that read to tell a story of really what the code is doing at each step of some kind of computation. And the problem with that is that, of course, once you're running a lot of servers in parallel and a lot of processes on those servers, that narrative is not linear anymore, and and of course the events that are kind of describing what's happening in the system, they're all interleaved, and so taking that and getting some kind of meaningful insight into what's happening in a real running system is very difficult. So structured logging, as we know it in .NET right now, especially because ASP.NET Core has popularized a lot of this, as well as Serilog, which is a library that I started building several years ago, has really just taken that same printf kind of debugging, where you see a .NET format string like hello, and this will be my username, and we've replaced that with the notion of templated messages, where instead of actually putting a numeric placeholder in there, we attach a property to that event, and then when, of course, we run these applications that are instrumented with structured logs, we still get that kind of debugging experience of reading a log of what's going on in an app. But Serilog and ASP.NET Core as well, both will actually preserve the values of those pieces of data that got pulled into the event, so that later on, when you want to actually go and record that perhaps to a diagnostics service or some other kind of structured data store. That log event can be formatted out, and those same events that you can read during development time can be searched as structured data, in a busy system. So we can filter for things like name and Blumhardt and find those events that were raised just from my machine, for instance.
Right. So rather than having to do gigantic searches through reams of text to find things that correspond,
rather than have to, rather than have to open up Notepad and then realize that what you're searching for was too complex to actually find in Notepad, and then pulling out the book on regular expressions,
of course,
regular expression builders online, and
exactly.
So we've kind of simplified from there, and instead of throwing away all of that information that you had about your log event once you formatted it into text, we now preserve all of that information that you have, so that then later on when you're going to go and do diagnostics, you're not really thinking about narrative messages anymore. You're thinking about a stream of events that have properties, and those are the properties that you're going to use as an engineer to go back from some kind of failure to trace all of the related events that happened earlier on in the system.
Yep. So one of the ways that people kind of tie these events together, especially in like a microservices scenario where messages get sent all over the place, there's a whole lot of different sets of logs. They might have a correlation ID or some kind of, this is an identifier of thing that happened.
Yeah, well, the correlation IDs are interesting because like log data is really highly dimensional. To use a too technical term, but it's interesting. Correlation is definitely one thing that you get out of structured logs, and that's really important, where you can trace all of the events that happen kind of downstream from some activity. The tough thing about diagnostics, though, and why including the actual event data as well as properties is really important, is that when you're trying to find the root cause of a bug, there are just so many dimensions and axes that you need to slice through that data on. It might be that, I'm seeing problems with transactions, but only where the number of items in an order was greater than 15, or it's the individual event, it's the data on those individual events that you usually find to actually.
I see.
And so then I think that one place where what you'd think of as correlation IDs in, say, WCF, if you've done that kind of programming with that kind of built-in correlation, is that we do in ASP.NET apps now, since the ASP.NET Core revision, we get correlation IDs that are built into the request pipeline through middleware.
All right.
And if we have an ASP.NET app, this one's set up using Serilog as well. When we run this one, we find actually there are a couple of very interesting things about ASP.NET Core when it comes to log output. The first is that out of the box, there's just a huge amount of log data that's surfaced by the framework that was completely missing in all of the earlier versions of ASP.NET. So here, we started up our ASP.NET Core app, and these are all events that were built into ASP.NET Core itself, not added to my demo app, so the template out of the box.
Right.
And the kind of information that you can get out of the apps now will tell you what kind of, what a request was coming in on for a request URL or the HTTP method. But also things like which controller was chosen to handle a route and what the arguments were, and then right through to the very end of the pipeline when we're getting views and things rendered out. And so all that information is now exposed by the framework in a structured form,
right.
Which means that if you start to build your own logging into these apps, you can start to correlate your application logging with all of the mechanics of the framework, and say when, if we have a look in a bit more detail at the logs from this one, you'll see how when we have an error in our application code, we can actually follow that back through the request handling that came out of the ASP.NET framework itself.
Right. So that logging, the logs we were seeing just then, that's out of the box. You didn't add any other... With
Serilog plugged in, only because
the
console formatting out of the box is a bit more verbose, so it takes up a bit more screen real estate. But so ASP.NET Core comes with a logging framework built in called Microsoft.extensions.logging, which is part of the .NET Core platform.
Yep.
They have a bunch of interfaces that can handle all kinds of different logging styles, like structured logging and text logging, They have provisions for event IDs and all kinds of other switches, and then a series of providers. And there's a default console provider that you get.
All right.
There's an application insights provider, a debug trace provider, and all of those have got different ways of rendering out the data. So the provider I'm using is based on Serilog because Serilog is actually a complete logging pipeline, so it's not just an interface over a bunch of providers, but it offers a lot of other facilities like enriching events with correlation IDs and dispatching to 100 different targets.
Right.
Yeah, so in this app we've got just one controller. You can see the template hasn't really had a lot of modification.
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with the Hello World template.
Yeah,
I do that a lot.
Yeah, so we just take a parameter from the URL, and we print that out as our greeting. If we're greeting Damian, you see this is the typical developer exception page that you get in ASP.NET.
Yep.
The nice thing is that with just plugging in that provider, we get all of those exceptions that are caught by the framework now. If you remember in the earlier versions of ASP, you'd have to set up global exception handlers and things and wire all that in yourself. When errors get thrown in ASP.NET, you see we look at Seek, which is the product that a company builds. It's just an HTTP-based log server, and we collect that info from the ASP.NET app as well. You'll see that we get an unhandled exception occurred. In this case, we get the exception, which is, don't know that name, sorry. But you also see that this correlation data that's baked in from the framework is exposed as well, so that now we had an error happen in the app. We have a request ID. We can search based on the request ID in whatever log store we're using, and we get not just our application's events, but we get all of the framework data as well.
The custom events. So the data, for the most part, that we're receiving here comes straight from the ASP.NET framework. It's just being collected by the
yeah, exactly. But but as your application grows, obviously, because this is the default template, you find that you're really engineering the diagnosability and the transparency into the app as you go. So you see that the controller that's failing here was greeting Damian.
Yep.
And this is one of our events that we've popped in to home controller. You see, I've preempted that you were coming along here. But see, there's that same template for the log message with the name plugged into it.
Right.
And then when we've collected that in JSON format, we've got the name there. And so now we can start to test a theory. Do all of the requests where we greet Damian fail? This is an earlier one with no request ID, but should we run that same request again? We can start to test that theory. So we find another one where the name is Damian, and then we can pivot back to the request ID, and we're navigating between those dimensions of data, the name of the person that we were dealing with in this case, and how that request finished.
So Serilog is kind of Seek, which is what we're looking at, is a good way of navigating through all that data as well. But ultimately, it's logging. There's logging of structured stuff to make this stuff easier.
There's two ways, I guess, to handle log data, and they used to be antagonistic. You would either collect text and then deal with it in the wash, trying to figure out how to extract meaning from the text, or you would collect JSON. And then have to try to figure out how to read that without your eyes bleeding from the angle brackets and things.
Yeah.
Where we've really landed with Serilog, with structured logging in .NET, you can really choose the format based on the target. So in this case, we can view text logs in the console, and we can send JSON logs to anywhere we like. So we might send those to Seek or to some other log server, or we could potentially format them up as XML and drop them into a table in SQL Server and use XML query.
Right. Cosmos DB, any kind of JSON
data
store.
Exactly. Cosmos DB is an interesting one there.
Yeah, I had to throw that in.
Totally. Yeah. So I think that the important thing, actually, you do need to collect logs during development for them to be useful in production. So. When we used to kind of test it in production, before the days of really having unit tests, we know how that went, and testing didn't ever really become an engineering discipline until we started to use unit tests to drive development. And diagnostics are the same. It doesn't really matter where you're going to store your logs in production. There are lots of options, and often it's just a switch to pipe them to a different destination. But you have to make sure that you're using your logs during development, at least as a sanity check, to make sure that the code executed as you're expecting. And when the code doesn't execute as it's expecting, and yet the log shows no trace of that, then you've obviously got an opportunity to improve the logs. Or when something did go wrong and you can't use those logs instead of a debugger to go back and figure out what led to that problem. And that iterative process of making those logs better is the only way that when you get to production, you're not going to be faced with just a wall of useless information.
Right. So what's important here, I guess, is the fact that we are able to diagnose what happens in production. And as a developer, like, I need the ownership of that to make sure that, you know, when something does go wrong with my code, that it's able to be diagnosed.
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't until we started to take responsibility for testing as developers and test our code as we built it, and then feed back the quality of the code to improve those tests, that before we actually started to have some success with unit testing with, you know, better quality software. So it's the same situation with logs. Unless we are the ones who are diagnosing problems from our logs, whether we're doing that in development, trying to find the cause of something that we're building not working, or in production, feeding that experience of trying to solve a problem back into producing better diagnostics in the app and better logs is really the only way that we're going to then be confident we've got what we need when something's actually gone wrong in production. Yeah,
definitely. Can't just throw the problem to ops anymore.
Throw it over the wall.
Throw it over the wall to ops. Yeah, that's not acceptable anymore. Well, so that's awesome. Thanks for spending the time like talking through structured logging. I guess the main message here is, you know, being able to diagnose stuff in production is really, really important, and structured logging is a great way of being able to sort through those logs.
Crucial part of that.
Crucial part of that. Awesome.
Definitely.
Well, thanks so much for your time, and we will see everybody next time on the DevOps Lab.